Coach, thank you very much for joining me today on this Simple Coach to Coach interview. I know you're probably knee deep in the spring, as all the coaches are, and so you taking the time today is I'm really grateful for it.
Well, thanks for having me. Believe it or not, we actually haven't started our spring yet, our spring season, because graduation is not until Memorial Day weekend.
Wow.
Yeah, so we start Monday. But yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you. So yeah, that's kind of late. That is late. I thought it was always
Very late.
just before spring break or just before or after spring break. But
yeah, I don't know many coaches who haven't started yet. So
yeah. All right. So, if you could maybe we could just begin with, tell me about your coaching journey and how you ended up at Susquehanna. I know you're a grad from Susquehanna, but I'm sure that it's not a straight line.
It really isn't. No. So yeah, I graduated 2006 from Susquehanna, and one of my teammates who was a year ahead of me, Nick Hoover, he, during my senior year, let me know several times because he had heard I was, quasi interested in coaching, didn't really know what I was going to do with my degree. Said he was working at Westminster College, which is in Western PA, about an hour north of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And working for a guy named Girish Thakar. And Girish was coaching the men's and the women's team, which he still does to this day. And said, there's a grad assistant job. If you want to go there, take some master's classes, you can do that. But if I didn't know what I was doing, and he knew I wanted to work out of college in some aspect, so he kind of talked me into it. I went out there, met with Girish. He's a great guy. And I got offered the job, and I started that following fall of 2006. And within 2 weeks, I just fell in love with it. I was working with both teams, men's and women's. I was the assistant for the women's team. I was sort of the goalkeeper coach for the men's team because that's what I played in college. And I mean, immediately I started just asking questions. Is this something I can do for a job? And Girish was like, of course, what do you think I do? This is my job. And I called back to Coach Finley. And he said, yeah, man, like it's something, this is the path you're going to take. If you're going to do it, you got to start somewhere. So I was there for 2 seasons. One, I was essentially men's goalkeeper coach, women's assistant coach. And it flipped the following year. I was the men's assistant coach, women's goalkeeper coach, but still had a hand working with both teams, both years. We had some success both seasons. And, after that second year, I thought there was an opportunity available. And then you're in 2008. And that's when a lot of finances for a lot of places started going in the opposite direction of where they wanted. And a lot of full-time jobs that I was looking at and thought I had chances at became part-time jobs.
Yeah.
And one of them that I thought I had a bit of a handshake deal on at one point sort of turned into a part-time job, and then it turned into a volunteer job. So I was quickly out of coaching. And, I, again, reached out to Girish, reached out to Jim, and asked them both, what's my opportunity here? And they said, you got to do what you got to do to make money. You're not, but you want to keep your hand in coaching as best you can if you're going to continue this someday. So, I'm plugging away. I'm applying to lots of jobs. And I worked part-time as like a JV coach at St. Joseph's Academy in Flowertown, PA, while living with my parents, and then trying to find other jobs. And like, I'm doing sales and life insurance. I'm doing all this stuff just to try and figure out what I want to do. And I ended up getting this interview, and I go on to campus. I won't say what the college was, but it was a really good gig. And I'm like super pumped. I'm on campus for like 5 hours, and to the point where the assistant who I'd be replacing hands me all of his recruiting materials that he's accumulated.
Oh my gosh.
And he's like, yeah, take this home. You got the gig. And I'm like, awesome. So I get on the road and I start driving, and I'm about 20 minutes from campus, and I get a call from the head coach, and he says, I need you to turn around and bring me those recruiting materials, because we actually ended up offering the job to somebody else, and they took it when they heard that we were going to offer you the job. So that was a kind of a crazy circumstance. And honestly, that was the first time I questioned, this might not be for me.
Yeah.
Not that I didn't want to coach, but it seemed too difficult. And then sure enough, about a month later, Coach Finley, my former coach, calls me and says, listen, my assistant job opened up, and I want you to apply. We'll go through the process, and if it works out, it works out. And sure enough, I became his assistant coach in 2010 that summer. I worked with him, men's team. We had a pretty good year. And then the following year, and this is how life works sometimes, we're in Canada with the men doing a preseason trip, kind of like teams do. Yeah. And we get a call from the athletic director, and Coach Finley gets a call saying, the women's coach who had just been hired that spring just resigned. It's about 2 weeks before the start of preseason. And can you take over both teams this fall? And because he had done it, Jim Finley, our men's coach here, was the women's coach and men's coach simultaneously for I think 5 or 6 seasons. He was when I was playing here, and he was just like, I'm willing to step up and help out, but there are 4 or 5 games where there's just in different locations on the same day. My suggestion, if possible, is to make Nick the associate head coach and give him the opportunity to coach those games, and we go from there. And I went 1-4. I'll never forget it. It felt like every game that I was coaching, Coach Finley, who wasn't there, I wasn't able to pull it off. And the games that both of us were there, we somehow won. I think it says a lot about my experience, but it was a solid season actually in comparison to what the women's program had done the previous 4 or 5 years. So I got offered the opportunity to be the head coach on sort of a part-time basis. The job had sort of separated in the previous year. The coach was there for a while, Kathy Krupa. She was coaching women's soccer and softball simultaneously. Oh, wow. So talk about something that just wouldn't happen these days. And when she took on just coaching softball and an administrative duty as well, the job got split up and it was made part-time. And so long story short, tough at this point. I told you I was going to talk a lot.
That's okay. Keep going.
Yeah. I got asked to be the part-time head coach, and there were some things that allowed me to sort of make it work financially. I was able to live on campus and do some other things around campus, and there was a stipend, and overall, I was working it part-time, but was still able to do it. And in 2012 was my first year as the head coach in a part-time basis. About 3 years after that, the job got full-time status. And I had to re-interview for it. I had to reapply for it, all that circumstance. And, fortunately I was able to be given the chance to keep the job and take it on full time. So I think since 2015 or the fall of 2016, somewhere in there, the job's been full time, and here I am now.
All right. So just to clarify, you didn't go to Westminster for the soccer. You actually went there for grad school. Like, you had no intention at some point before then of being like, soccer is going to be my career. Is that?
Well, it's funny. I didn't until I talked to Nate. So Nate Gibney is actually now the men's coach at Lycoming, and someone you should definitely talk to if he's willing to. So Nate really talked me into it, and just is like, man, like, just come out and do it. I know this is what I want to do. And I think you'll figure that out too. Because, you get a college degree, and I'm sure a ton of coaches get this, my college degree is in public relations. And when you're 22 years old, you put 4 years into getting that degree, you're like, well, I have to have a job in public relations. Right. And it wasn't until I got there that it solidified what I had been leading towards, which is I want to coach. So I went out there not really knowing. It was sort of more or less like, take a chance on this. Worst case scenario, come out with a master's degree, right? Even though it wasn't in anything I was going to use it in necessarily. It was in education, And but it really was sort of just a leap, and basically 3 people talked me into it. It was Nate, it was Girish, and it was Jim Finley.
Yeah. Okay. That's, you know what? If all else fails, you could always go back to life insurance. Because
That's if you knew how bad I was at selling life insurance, you would know that is not an option. I'm sure I'm bad at a lot of things, but I don't think there's anything I'm worse at than that. So,
I told Jamie Gunderson when he told me, he's like, hey, I was accounting. I was going into accounting. Accounting was my thing. And then
James is a much smarter guy than I am. So
I told him, I was like, yeah, well, I think accounting will always be there or something like that. It's like,
for him, yes,
don't
I could
worry.
totally see that.
Yeah. Hey, I started asking coaches this because I've said it before. What you see here, this is what I've been in for the last 5 years of my, obviously, this short career as a YouTube video guy, but my regular work, I've always worked from home, so it's not a big deal for me. But so when COVID hit, I wasn't impacted, right? Like, I'm still sitting in the same chair. And so I started asking after I heard some stories, but like, how tough was that COVID year for you guys, and how much of a challenge was it from a coaching perspective, knowing that you want to you're constantly building and building and growing and growing. And so how difficult was that time period?
It's one of those things where I look back on it now and it's such a whirlwind. And I think not just in the coaching world, but in the world in general, what COVID was when you first experienced it to what you remember it as. I think you would be amazed at what you thought then versus what you think now, and all the things you would have done differently. But my biggest frustration was for our student athletes, was for our players. They, be it the seniors who this is their final season. Most of them, if not all of them, never even consider the idea of just, oh, well, I'm going to take this year off, because it's being taken away from me. But I'll come back and do a fifth year. That wasn't in the cards for a lot of them, mostly because they all had probably jobs lined up or internships or, grad school lined up. And it was just like taking a pause in what their general plans were to come back and play another year of college. So I felt terrible for them. I felt terrible for our first year players coming in. That was their first college experience. And obviously our sophomores and our juniors as well, because, and I'm sure tons of coaches say this, I really felt like that was a big year for us, coming off of losing in the conference championship game, the amount of effort and energy the day after we lost in 2019, like everyone's in the weight room, everyone's in here. And it's like, oh, wow, we had a tough loss, but man, they seem motivated, and felt like he had a really good return in class, good incoming class. And 2020 was just like, that was going to be the year, and everyone I'm sure has that feeling, but you lose a lot of that, when you're starting to find out that your season might not happen in March, April, June, then the summer. The things that you first started with, like, oh my gosh, they're going to cancel our season. We were going to be so good. That starts losing the amount of importance of that. Not that it wasn't important, but you lose that. And you start thinking, oh my gosh, the entire experience for these young people collegiately is going to be dramatically different. And, what's virtual learning? what you had no idea what that was going to be. You had no idea what. So, I think a lot of us, and Lemmark did a great job. Some of the coaches did a great job heading it up, and our conference commissioner did a great job. We did like a virtual competition. People recorded how many push-ups they could do, and we did like a spring competition, and everyone had to submit data in an Excel spreadsheet, try and make the best of it. I thought that was kind of cool, but I felt like the biggest challenge for me was going to be, how can I continue to impact, these young people whose parents and they put their faith in me to do so for 4 years. I try and impact my players beyond the soccer field, in some way, shape, or form, be it just sitting down and talking, or helping them with anything academically they might need, recommendations, references, things like that. And when you get that big chunk of a soccer season taken away, you feel like your impact on them and how you can positively impact them has really been diminished. And I really felt sort of like, not helpless, but like worried that I wasn't going to be able to help them in the way that they really needed. And then fortunately we were able to have a semblance of a spring season this past spring, and we played 3 games, had some practices, very different everything. But the biggest challenge for me personally, to answer your question, was, how do I help these people who I had such an easy way of not helping, but like impacting. It was all so routine, right? Every year, same way I get to help them, and you try and figure out ways to improve that, but that was taken away. And how can I do it in other ways? And I think we did some Zooms, some leadership building, things like that. But it's just, it felt very different. And I felt not helpless. That's a little dramatic to help them, but I felt very, I think I used this word already, diminished in my capacity to impact them. And I think if you ask most coaches, the core of why they do what they do, it's working with and helping for the young people who come through their programs.
No, everyone is sort of helpless, like you said. Maybe that's overly dramatic, but sort of marginalized by the circumstances, right? Like, how do you, and this is great, right? I mean, the fact that we can do this for this purpose is great, but when you're trying to build a relationship and sort of help folks along, this isn't the way, right? It just doesn't necessarily work that way. And so, hey, so I was doing my research yesterday, and I thought the most interesting thing about your bio or at least the one thing that I was like, that you don't see that necessarily very often, where said, it said something to the fact that you were bringing stability back to the program after a 15-year period of 5 different coaches. I was just wondering, could you talk about that, and maybe more broadly about how important you think it is for a coach to stay? I'll even just say for a 4-year period, right? So that the freshmen graduate and they've had the same coach.
So I was fortunate, very, very lucky that within my time here as head coach, it went from a part-time to a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you talk to any coach, and beyond just obviously the amount of money you're getting paid and benefits and all of that, that's the on paper difference between part-time versus full-time. But you've talked about this already, the amount of effort and energy that a coach can dedicate when they are full-time and this is their job,
Mm-hmm.
into building and designing and cultivating a program, that's different than what you can as a part-time coach. And that's not to say there aren't some unbelievable part-time coaches. There are. Our volleyball coach here at Susquehanna is an unbelievable part-time coach, and there are some in soccer as well. But when you have a secondary responsibility that's taking up a lot of your time, you simply just can't do everything time-wise, unless you're fortunate enough to not need money. And part-time is, you can dedicate all your time. You're just in part-time entitled. But I think that in itself is a huge change. And I think what you talked about, stability as far as being there for an extended period, is huge. Coach Finley, like I talked about, he was coaching 2 teams simultaneously in the same season. And I don't know many coaches still do that, but when he was doing it, he still was only able to give so much to his men's team, and then right around turn afterwards and have a women's practice. And that was still impactful. The stability that he brought, the team was pretty successful for the 6 years he had them. And that's because he was the same coach for 6 years, right? So like you talked about that 4 year, you see them graduate. I think you look around at most of the programs that are ultimately very successful. Jamie Gunnarson's a perfect example, right? He goes and wins a national championship in his first year as head coach. And I think Christopher Newport's an unbelievably talented program team. Dan did a great job. The coach before Dan did a great job. But Jamie's been there for a while. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the new head coach winning a national championship was a coach that had been there with that team. His personality, his stamp, his recruits, his being a part of and helping build that culture there. That is probably just as much a reason as their talent and his coaching ability to them winning that, to having that much success this past year. And I think that's a huge part of it. I think that's why programs who can have a coach for an extended period can see some of that success, even if it's not in wins and losses. It's just, players graduate more in those programs. Probably they have more academic success. They have more alumni success. They have more involvement. I think wins and losses can be an easy way and not always the best way to measure the success of a program, even though, obviously we're all here to win. But being somewhere consistently and having your personality and your stamp and honestly your growth, you developing along with the program, I think really adds to it. So I think that might be to what the bio is referencing to.
I always say that, and I think a head coach who's been around for a while, it's part of, like, culturally, I just think it builds some accountability, right? Me as a player suddenly be accountable to you, and knowing that you're going to be around, or that you've been around for a while, well, that makes that accountability all the greater, right? If you're a recycled every year, you don't know who you're going to get next. It's like, I don't know you anything, right? I just think that's
true.
Yeah. I'm going to say it, like, you've had a lot of success with the program. I'll say again, and I'm not measuring the success in terms of all the things you just talked about, but I'm just talking wins and losses, what I know, what I can see, right? Like, you've really turned it around. And do you think it was, now we talked about the sense of stability, or did you come in to really try to build something? I thought I would say different, but maybe you were just to start from scratch, almost like, because if it was part-time beforehand, how much can you really build as a program, right? Like, were you just starting, okay, it's a new, I'm a head coach. I'm full time. I'm going to build towards something. Maybe you could explain that a little bit, just that those, especially the early days, right? Like just when you came on board.
Yeah, so I think it was a unique situation for me. So I was able to be around the program without coaching it my first year, right? And it's weird. I graduated 2006, so there's like a 4-year gap between when I graduated and when I came back. I have friends and know a lot of players who played on the women's team when I was a player here, and knew what the program was about then. The biggest stamp on the program that had been here previous to me coming here probably was Coach Finley, just because that was the most success they had in any year period. I think his final year they went to the conference championship. But in a sense, you're still starting over, right? It still is. You want to make it yours. I think there are going to be some coaches who walk into programs that have had like just constant success over and over, and they don't want to reinvent the wheel when they're starting there. But at the same time, they still have to be themselves. They have to, if things are wildly different than what their personality and what their strengths are as a coach would dictate the program being going forward, you have to make some changes. I'll be honest, and I think I would assume most coaches feel this way. Their first year being a head coach, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was taking a ton of advice from a lot of different people. I was 100% just arrogant enough to think all I need is better players, right? Just you bring me the fastest, the most technical, the strongest, most athletic, and we're going to win games instantaneously. But I still was willing to take advice from just about anybody. And there's a lot of people in this building and a lot of coaches who are working that probably were sick and tired of my phone calls and emails and texts pretty quickly. But I was just excited, I was just excited to get into it. That 1 year I got to be the associate head coach and see how Coach Finley, took on the team for 1 year and had a pretty good year. I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that, and this is a guy I've been coaching for 20 plus years at that point, or almost 20 years. And I'm like, the amount you don't know is incredible. And I think my biggest mistake starting off was, as long as I get good players, we'll be fine. And I don't have to worry about anything else. If they're good students, great. If they're average students, whatever, as long as they get into the school. Let me tell you what a stupid idea that is. And then, the idea of personality and character, that was something that's like a bonus to me at that time. I always talk about my hierarchy of traits that I require, and I flipped it in probably a year and a half. It took me to figure this out. It started off with, when I go to recruit a player and bring them into our program, awesome player, solid academically, and hopefully they're a good person too. And I have completely flipped that. I want awesome people who are going to work their butts off to be the best student they can be. And then you got to if you're going to make the team and impact, you're going to have to be a good player. But 3 doesn't matter without 2, and 2 doesn't really matter without 1. I've talked to a bunch of players, a bunch of coaches. They've had some unbelievably talented players they've thrown off their teams for either just the lackadaisical attitude they have towards their academics, but most of the time because of their awful attitude in general. And I think most coaches have come to discover that you want really talented players, but you can't sacrifice other things for it. And it took me a while to figure that out. And I think once I did, and once I really started emphasizing that, you still find awesome players who happen to be great students who want to work hard academically and really great people. But if those aren't really pressing and important to you, it doesn't matter how many talented players there are on your field. You won't be able to coach them. They won't be able to get better. And when things go bad, which happens for everyone, I don't care how good your team is, it struggles the most. And I think that was the biggest cultural difference we've taken is we expected to win more. When I took over the program, it felt like losing wasn't that big a deal. And, I don't want them going to bed crying themselves to sleep after a loss necessarily, but I want them caring about it. I want them to have a desire to be better and expecting to win. I think our team, when I first took over, just the idea of winning games wasn't something that was expected. It was more or less a happy surprise when it happened. And you got to be good enough to expect to win, but you should still expect to win, and you should be competitive enough to put yourself in a position to win. And the personality changes. Not that we didn't have good personalities on the team, but I specifically sought out what I consider to be the right type of character to help this program take a change. And that was the biggest shift, those 3 traits flipping and that being a big emphasis. And that's not to say we don't have people on our team who are a struggle at times. I think I have a decent sized, level character, but I could be a struggle at times too.
Yeah.
And I think it's all about, someone asked me, does your team actually, I get asked this all the time by recruits and parents, your team's like really close. Are they best friends? Are they great? And I always say, yeah, for the most part, but person who's 1 and person who's 30, and that big gap between their personalities probably aren't going to allow them to be as natural of friends as each other. My question to developing a big program, a good program, wasn't can they be best friends? It's can they respect each other?
Yeah.
Can they play together? And when there's tension within the team, which happens every season, how quickly do you get over it? How unimportant do the small things become, personality difference wise? And I think that's been a big change for us. We used to have like, not incidents, but you know what I mean? Like tension build up because everyone's competitive, everyone's tired. It's midterms week. You know how it is. Your best friends on the team become your most frustrating roommate that night, right?
Yeah.
And the next day it'd be like awkward, and it'd be awkward the next day. And I'm like, oh man, how do we change this? And then I really do feel like that's just not the thing anymore. When awkwardness began, it ended quickly. And I think that's been a helpful change going from day 1 to now.
Yeah. I was, as a follow-up to that hierarchy that you flipped, really good person, is going to bust their tail academically, and then soccer player. Is that sort of, are those your non-negotiables that you work with, or are there other non-negotiables that you have with folks on your team that, they have to fit these criteria in order to be part of the program? Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, I think all of them are non-negotiable. It sounds weird. Like you put these categories up there and then you're like, well, where does people fall on that? But I think there's a spectrum for each one of those, right? A great level of character doesn't mean they have to be this bubbly personality walking around and smiling all the time. They just have to be consistently a good person to you, to your players, their teammates, to their professors, to their fellow, students, to the community. Like you just have to be consistently a good person. How that personality manifests itself, be it someone's a little more reserved, chooses their words a little more carefully, or someone is a lot more outgoing, and anywhere in between, that's fine with me. But the portion of that that's really important, part of your character goes, is you're a good person and you're respectful. Same thing with the student. You don't have to get a 4.0 to be on our team or get into our college. You don't have to get a 3.0 to get necessarily. You have to be working your hardest to get what is most achievable for you.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge parallel with that and you as a player. Not every player who comes into our program or any program has the capability of being an all-conference, all-region player. They just don't. Not everyone has that ability. But are you working as hard as you can to be the best version of a player that you can be?
Yeah.
Those are non-negotiables, and everyone has a bad day, even a bad week. But bad months are not acceptable, because then that's a 30-year season that someone is taking off from having a high level of character, having a high pursuit of academics, and having a high pursuit of athletic achievement.
Yeah. Hey, let me ask you, shifting over more into the soccer, and I ask this just because I know the constraints of the season, right? It's short. You're playing on a a Tuesday, and then maybe a Thursday, and then a Saturday, and so but I'm always curious, do you prepare? Do you do a lot of work into preparing against specific teams, or do you just put more emphasis on how you want Susquehanna to play? Is that
No, I totally get it. Yeah, I think it really depends on 2 things: the time of the season you're in and your opponent. So we are going to start off with Misericordia as our first game next year, and I think they went to the Sweet 16 and lost in double OT to go to the Elite Eight. I mean, one of the 3 or 4 best attacking teams I saw all last year. Mark's done an unbelievable job with that program. We play them every year, and to spend a ton of time on what Misericordia specifically does for the first game of the season wouldn't make a lot of sense. We know they're going to be really talented. We know they're going to be fast, like all the things that you sort of know just based upon what they've done in the past. and we're still discovering who we are. Division III, as you know, is so different. It's like a 8 to 10 day preseason.
Yeah.
Maybe you get a scrimmage or two in, but for the most part, unless you're returning like all your starters back and most of your returners are upperclassmen, there's going to be a lot of tinkering to do. And if you're bringing in a pretty healthy first year class like we are next year, there's going to be, so discovering who you are is going to be critical first. Yeah. And to make a ton of changes based upon your opponent early on wouldn't make a lot of sense. I also think it wouldn't make a lot of sense depending upon how you match up against them. So if we play a 4-3-3, if you play a 4-3-3 and you think that matches up really well against the opponent you're playing against, then you say, well, we're not going to change a lot. We'll know what they do, specifically set pieces, defensive shape. If they have a specific standout player, we do reports and scouts on that kind of thing. We watch film as a team, but a lot of the times early on in the season, you're still discovering who you are. I feel like the limited amount of time we can get these players to all sit down at the same time and watch film or the 2 hours at maximum you get in a practice per day, you can only spend so much of it on your opponent. Now, as the season goes on, you feel like you've developed your sort of, form, your shape, your tactics, then you can start to tinker. And a good example for that, what last year was our first conference game of the year, I think, was Scranton, who, was just had an unbelievable season last year and most years. And, going in that, we had a ton of film on them. We knew we didn't match up particularly well in certain areas with them. And we made one very definitive, very specific and big change, but it was only one. And everyone else, was basically told to do their job. And we ended up losing that game. I think it was 2-1. It was a close game. We scored first. It was really competitive. Ultimately, they just were better and scored 2 really nice goals. But you were able to do that because that was our first conference game. So it means you have a bunch of non-conference games under your belt, and you know what you could do to change.
Mm-hmm.
The following game, I forget who we played, but it was a non-conference game, and I'd seen them play, and I was like, we match up really well with this team. We're not going to do a lot of talking about this team right now. Let's talk about what we did against Scranton that worked, that didn't, but we got to get back to what we normally do, because the big change we made against Scranton, you don't keep in there for the next game. And then you do that as the season goes along, and I think some coaches, have their way of playing. I don't know that this is what Scott does at Messiah, but my assumption is Messiah plays the way Messiah plays every time against every team, and I would too if I was them. And there's a reason for that, right? Like I'm sure, but again, I can't imagine that if they're playing against one of those national ranked teams they play out of conference beginning of the year every year, and there's some stud striker who just does something very different than what they've seen, that they don't know about that and talk about it. But for the most part, my assumption is they're going to play the way they play most of the time against everyone. So I think it really depends on your program, depends on your strengths. If we were 8-0 going into Scranton and beating everyone soundly and played awesome, and then maybe we just are like, hey, we're gonna roll and do what we do. But we weren't, and we knew we still had some weaknesses and didn't match up perfectly well against them. So for that game specifically, we made a pretty big change.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all make sense? Or I know it's all very
no, it does. It just, like I said, I'm just trying to. I wonder about time, like how efficient use of time, right? Like that's the big thing is you get limited exposure to your team in a regular season. How much do you want to inundate them with something like a scouting report, right? Like, and is it enough? And is there enough time? Because to me, the only good scouting report is one that you could go over with the team and then say, this is what we're going to do, and then train for what you're going to do and have it almost sink in so that when you play the game and you say, okay, this is how we're going to play, it becomes easier. So I've always wondered about just that, right? And I don't think the time is available for that, right? Like it's just
something to add to that is, and it's something I've experienced, is sometimes you'll do the paralysis by analysis thing, right? And you I've seen this team play 8 times. I've watched every minute of the film. My assistants watched it. We've broken it down. We know what they do. We're going to spend the next, basically I would say you get 2 practices to prepare for every team, because that's usually the gap between game to game. And you never want to be spending a practice on Friday preparing for opponent on Sunday when you have a Saturday game, right? No one wants to overlook the next opponent. So let's pretend you spend all day Monday and Tuesday. You get away from any technical, training. You get away from the rest of your tactical training on your formation, and you're just concentrating on them. And they've been playing a 4-2-3-1 all season. And then you roll out to their place on Wednesday, and they're playing a 4-4-2.
Yeah.
What have you spent your time doing? All that time.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that that's always happens, but it has. And so I don't think you can go all in any one way. It's different probably when you're going to the NCAA tournament, and when we were going up against Swarthmore, 2018, they had first team All-American Maren McCoy. I didn't assume they were going to move Maren to center back. You know what I mean? Like you could still healthily make a decision, an educated guess as to what they were going to do, and figured out a way to stop that player. But if you just are like, we're just going to stop this 4-3-3, and then they're a 3-5-2, you're like, well, what did we just waste our time on? So I think you got to find a balance.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So conversely, what do you end now, since you're actually going into the spring, like your spring practice is about to begin, or soon is going to begin. What does your focus for this spring end up being? Is it more of do you focus more on the technical aspects of the game, or is it tactical, or are you just sort of like, hey, I just want us to be together as a team?
So I think you always have to start with the technical side of it. Division III college soccer is just so different than what 95% of your players have been used to the last 4 years of their lives. So some play only club, but most play a club in high school, and they have other things they're doing. But when you think about it, the amount that you're formally coaching a player when they get to Division III, it's so much less than they've been getting formally coached for 4 years of high school, right? They got their high school season and they got their club season, probably doing some sort of indoor. Even when it's cold, they're outside. There's no, dead zone like there is in D3. They're being coached by someone basically year round. Then they get to Division III. They're coached by us from August to November, right? And then they're off until March. They're coached by you for 5 weeks, and then they're off until August. And how do you make up for that time? You really can't. It is on your players at Division III. And I think it was Mark at Misericordia who told me this, but when he knew, because obviously he's had an amazing amount of success at Misericordia, but he told me once when he knew that his program was definitively going in the direction he wanted, was when the players were as committed out of season as they were in season. And he saw that in them, and he saw when they came back for spring how their technical level, their fitness level, their athletic level didn't drop. And there is so much of that goes into it. But to answer your question, in my opinion, you have to, at minimum, get the rust out. You have to get those touches, get those runs, passing, simple stuff early. And then you definitely want to make sure they're enjoying themselves, because they only get 15 of these practices. So you got to roll the ball out and let them play with whatever your numbers are. Susquehanna is a little different than some schools, I'm sure, where we allow we require all of our students to do an abroad trip in their 4 years. And a lot of them will do a full semester, which for us is always going to be the spring. So 4 of our 5 juniors on the team are abroad this semester. So your numbers are down, right? Between them and your graduating players, your numbers are down. So it's not like you can play 11-11 be 11 a lot. So you got to figure out what's going to be best for your team. It also depends on what your goals are going into next year. We're graduating 11 players, 6 starters. So it's not like the 11 first-year players or 12, whatever you end up having coming in next year. Some big number of those are going to have a huge impact, plus the 4 who are abroad. So if you spend this entire spring just honing in on your formation and your shape, even if you're learning something new, and that's the entirety you spend on your spring, well, then the 11 first-year, 12 first-year players that are coming in and the 4 or 5 players that were abroad, they're not experiencing any of that. So
they're going to have no idea what you're talking about, right?
Right. So what can all those players who are abroad definitely do? They can get touches on the ball. They can knock the ball around with each other, or they can jump into some Sunday games, right? What can the first-year players who are playing high school and club soccer doing? They're still getting soccer in. So I think it's a balance. If you're bringing in a new formation for the next year, you want to introduce it. You want to sprinkle it in, talk about it in our one spring date of competition. You want to try it out. But if you're spending all spring on tactics, then you're probably in a very unique situation to not have any players off campus for being abroad, to not have any players doing a different sport. We have players who do 2 sports, to not be graduating a huge class or not be bringing in a big class. So that's how I look at it. So a lot of the spring, in my opinion, will be, technical work. And honestly, a category you didn't bring up is just being around each other again.
Yeah.
Just having fun and enjoying the sport that's been sort of away from them in a formal sense since November.
Yeah. Oh, that's the big one to me is a successful spring is half of it is just being all together and again, like you said, just sort of reconnecting into the game and getting back into it and sort of enjoying that fact that, oh my God, the weather's broke. I went to school in Ohio, right? So it was like the spring season was, or when we trained in the spring, it was, oh my gosh, no more snow. It was that simple,
it's like it's a transition, right?
It's like, this is so great. So this is an odd one that it totally off the beaten path, and I just thought of it. Have you been following all the NCAA rule changes, or some of them, the no subs in the
some of them? Yeah, I'm really
do you have any thoughts on that?
So remind me, did it get solidified that there's not going to be any?
No, I think there's a vote. The NCAA, the Division I coaches are voting. I forget how it works. It's more just the subbing rule to me. That's the one where you in the second half, it's going to be like the first. There's no reentry.
Yeah, I think that'd be a huge mistake for Division III. Again, I don't want to speak for all coaches, but the majority that I know, I feel like if I took a straw poll amongst some of my peers that I'm pretty friendly with, almost every one of them would say you have to allow at least one reentry in the second half. I understand the idea of it, the amount of stop and start of the game. But I mean, you look as high up as the Premier League, they just allowed for 5 subs to come in. Again, I think there's something to the idea of getting people to play, and convincing them. And at Division III, a lot of these rosters, our roster has been pretty big. Do they have to be big necessarily? Not this, no, but I think no one wants a roster of 22. And most people don't want a roster of 40, but you want somewhere in between. And let's say it's 30, right? Which I'd probably say is probably an average size roster within our conference right now. If your roster size is 30 and you're subbing all 10 positions that are field players, which most don't, but let's say you sub all 10 and maybe even 2 different players into the second half, you're still having 8 players sit out that game, or 7 players who just don't play at all. Imagine that dropping down to 15 or 16. And that not necessarily being something that you can even, get over with injuries, with the amount of games that you talked about. There's some weeks where you're getting 3 games in 8 days, and to not be able to let players play and jump back into a game seems like a rule change that would affect positively very few teams across the NCAA for soccer and negatively impact more. Just like everything else, I'm sure everyone would adjust to it at some point. But if the NCAA is going to stick by its mission and its standing as, we're trying to improve the experience for student athletes, I think that would be a move in the wrong direction for that specifically.
I don't know how I feel about it. The only thought that I have is, I guess, on the negative side, which is more than likely what ends up happening is that you're going to have coaches that are going to rely on a smaller number of players just by the to win the game, right? Whereas right now, I think, okay, there's a little bit more freewheeling. I could take somebody out, give them a 5-minute blow, get somebody back in, at least in the second half. And I just, I'm not so sure how I feel about that, right? Like after all, I hate to say it, like it's college soccer, right? Like, what's the experience about? Is it about sitting the bench, or is it about, like, no, it's about how many people can you get involved into the game? So anyhow.
And honestly, the amount of pressure mentally and physically you're putting on players through a 20-game season, for some of these 26-game season. I'm not saying, most players probably don't want to come off the field, and I get that, but we all know we have to make those decisions for them sometimes. And if you're telling a player, like, I think the quality would drop at Division III a lot. I really do. I mean, I think the quality would drop at most Division Ones, if I'm being honest, from what I've seen. If you have players who are playing an entire half, right? Like, who normally would get at least one 10-minute blow in the middle. I think that's, and I could be wrong. I'm sure this rule is being asked about and talked about and debated about for a reason. But from my own personal opinion, I think it would be it'd be a detriment to Division III soccer overall.
I suspect you're going to see kids break.
Yeah,
right. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I just think
you're seeing it already.
Yeah. I mean, already, without doing anything, you're seeing kids that break over just from overuse, right? Just because of the nature of the time frames. And realistically, you need 2 times the amount of recovery time for a game than you get now. 2 days, it should be 4, right? Like, hey, let me ask you, shifting over to the season, 2020 was what it was, right? Like, you can't, who knows, whatever we want to call that. And I still don't know how to categorize that year.
The COVID year. I think everyone calls it the COVID year. Yeah.
Yeah. COVID year. And again, sort of in hindsight, right? Like, you had a great season. Where do you think, what did you think your team was at in those, in the preseason, in those dog days of August? Yeah.
So I think preseason is always such an interesting experience. So this particular fall, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic region specifically was just getting crushed with storms all the time. And we had games getting canceled. We had practices getting canceled. And I really felt like there was an inconsistency in when we could practice and play. We had our first game of the season was canceled. We were supposed to play at Misericordia, which, looking back on it, might have been the worst game to miss. But actually, maybe playing them in the first game of the season would have been the only chance we had. But, okay, so that's canceled. And it's like, it's not canceled the day of, it's canceled an hour before.
Yeah.
So it's like that kind of thing didn't really give us a chance to find out who we were. It wasn't really until about, let's say, halfway through September, I really felt like I had a good grasp on what our team was going to be. And I think most coaches would say this: you didn't really have a single first-year class. You had 2 first-year classes in when you think about it, because the sophomores on your team really didn't have much of a first-year experience. And the grind that a first-year player has to go through to really, get that experience and understand, okay, this is what it takes to play college soccer. Instead of a quarter of your team really going through that, you had half your team going through that. And we're very fortunate. We had a very strong core returning. I would say the majority of our players starting were seniors and juniors, but we still had a lot of players who had to figure out, what that was going to be. And once you get about halfway through September, you start seeing people who can really handle the moment and not, and players who were physically quite ready and not. So I would say it was about September I realized, okay, we have a chance to really compete and go out for the conference again this year.
Yeah. Was there a point at the season? I mean, you talked about September-ish where you had a grasp of it. Was there a point in the season where you're like, man, this team, we could go the distance if things fall our way?
So within the conference, yes. It's funny, as you feel like your team is starting to play their best, you look on the conference website and you look at the results and you see Scranton's just steamrolling everyone, and and then you play against them, and they weren't the only team. I think our conference as a whole had a pretty solid, successful year. I think it's a very competitive conference every year. I think Amy has done an amazing job with E-Town. I think a Catholic had a down year for them. But it's Casey's second year with that program, really first when you think about it. And Krista and Jeff and Steph and Joe out of Juniata, I think's done a really good job taking over that. Like, the conference itself was good, but you couldn't take your eyes off what Scranton was doing every week because they hadn't lost, and they were beating teams, then they were bludgeoning teams, and then when you play them and you feel like it was a competitive game at their place, you realized, okay, top to bottom matchup wise, they're probably better team. You feel that when you play them and you see their players, but you don't feel like you don't feel like you're definitely going to lose them when you play them either. And that set up for our team. It was after that game we went on a run, and I said to our team, and you say things as a coach, I didn't mean it necessarily, but I said, I can't wait till we play against them again in the championship game, like something inspiring to say after a tough loss. And it felt like the team ran with that, not necessarily those words, but that attitude. Like, okay, that's the peak, right? That's the best it's going to get this year. How do we get to that? Because up to that point, we had sort of an up and down season. I thought we had some good games. I thought, we had some tough games. And a couple of our players really stepped their level up. Emily Wirt specifically had a fantastic season for us. She led us in points. She was a junior this past year. And she
all
just
conference, right?
She was first team all conference. She was I think she was co-side all district. I mean, she like 9 goals, 7 assists. But she reached a new level, which she hadn't really reached to that point. And the rest of our players sort of rounding out too, and some other players, some first year players started, seeing their playing time increasing, and they started getting more comfortable. Some sophomores where you're like, oh wow, this is my role on the team, and then you kind of knew what conference is about. So I think we went and won the rest of our conference games. I'm forgetting something here, but we ended up playing well in conference. Out of conference, becomes less frequent and sort of less important in a way. Not you want to win every game you play, but your concentration ultimately when conference season starts is on every conference game. Like if someone's really hurting after a conference game, you sit them in your midweek, to play in that Saturday game the following Saturday. But yeah, I thought we had a chance to win the conference, not because we were better than Scranton, but because we could beat them. And, not because we were better than E-Town, but because we could beat them, not because we were better than Moravian. But you know what I mean? Like that was the mindset. It wasn't like, oh, we're definitively better than all these teams. But you know how it is. Soccer is the most anyone can win sport. There really is. Whether your goalie's hot that day or the other team just isn't connecting their passes or, the most brilliant attacking player on the other team is just off that day. Like it's not like basketball where there's this accumulation of points that you have to overcome. It's one goal that you don't give up or you do. And so I felt like, were we going to go out and win 7 out of our 8 or 6 of our 7 conference games? Not necessarily. I didn't know that, but I felt like we could win every conference game we were going to play from there on out. And then it was just trying to do so. And some of them were more convincing than others for sure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe can you just touch on the Landmark and the challenges within it competitively? Because again, I'm sort of doing my research on the conference and understanding all the different teams, and I mean, there are some, I'll just call them healthy rivalries, right? Like you got some real deal battles that go on in your conference just to get you to a point where you can compete with them again, right?
Right. It's like first of all, I cannot talk more highly about the coaches in our conference, head and assistant coaches. Colleen has obviously had the most success at Scranton, and beyond being a fantastic coach, done a great job with the program. She's just super easy to talk to. I'm sure she's sick of talking to me by now. We're always, and that's the other thing. It's not just the Landmark; it's all coaches. You're sitting down, recruiting with them, chatting, and but on game days, it's fierce. It's tough. Like you just want to beat them so bad, and you want that for your players. You want that for your team. You want that for yourself, selfishly. But it is healthy. It's very competitive. I think every year there's going to be a team probably that has a rough year because of injuries or graduating a huge class or whatever. And every year there's going to be a team that's definitely on top. And in the last several years, and for most of the Landmark's history, it's been Scranton. Catholic had a great run there at one point. But Moravian is, I think it's always a 1-goal game when we play them. Elizabethtown, it's usually a 1 or 2 goal game. Goucher and Juniata and Drew, and it feels like it's a 1 or 2 goal game every time, and that's great. But it's frustrating, It's like it's so funny. Anytime a coach is like, and you hear this to the Centennial all the time, you're like, oh yeah, our conference is awesome, And it's like they say it begrudgingly, like
Yeah.
it's great that your conference is awesome, but man, does it make your job tough, you
Tough.
know? And
Yeah.
and I think that goes to the commitment of those coaches and those
Yeah.
players. And I think it talks about how deep the talent level overall at Division III is. I really
Yeah.
do. I think you have players who are playing Division III soccer who 10 years ago were potentially starting for Division I teams, and those players a lot of times will go to a lot of the same programs. You know, the Hopkins, the TCNJs,
Yeah.
the Christopher Newports, the Williams. Those schools are the Wash U. Those schools are always going to have fantastic players, but you're starting to see these unbelievably talented players,
Yeah.
you know, poke up out of on these rosters that necessarily didn't have them, and all of a sudden you're playing against them in conference every year, you know. And I think that's great. In our conference, obviously, we've played Scranton. We played 3 out of 4, three in a row conference championship games. We played Scranton. You know, we always have Catholic in playoffs. We had Elizabethtown in really tight battles last couple of years, and you know, Moravian and Drew, like. But it's not like just because Goucher and Juniata haven't made the playoffs in recent years that we're like, oh, that's just a skip. It's like Steph and Joe have their teams ready to go every single game.
Yeah.
And this past year, Goucher had a really good chance to make playoffs for the first time, and they have players on that team. I'm like, oh my gosh, that kid's unbelievable.
Yeah.
She would start for us in a heartbeat. And when you can say that about every team you play in conference, they're always going to be tough games. And when you have coaches who really care and push their players like we do in our conference, I think whether one team really just dominates like Scranton did this past year, that doesn't mean it wasn't a good year for the conference.
Yeah. I was speaking to, or I did an interview that's posted with Mike Toshak at St. Lawrence University, the men's coach, and he had said, you know, the biggest difference between when he first started in the 90s to now is that the quality of player has gotten much better, but it's also gotten much wider. So he was part of the team that went 22-0, and he's like, do I think we could go 22-0 ever again? He goes, no, because most teams, even the teams that are not having the best of years, have a much better talent than ever in the past. So it's that much more difficult to hit your stride every single game, because every single game ends up being a battle, right? So
100%.
Hey, just because I noticed, I think you played Wilkes. Did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, so Wilkes was one of our games that was canceled. We play Wilkes every year.
Yeah.
I know John, their coach, really well, and that was one of those games. We got there, we get off the bus, and lightning. We're like, oh, that game's canceled. But yeah, most years we play Wilkes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you just out of curiosity, with any thoughts on what Wilkes and Lycoming entering the conference in 2023? I mean, they look like good solid programs. I think they would add to the conference, but just curious.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for other sports because I don't know how they perform in other sports as much. But for soccer, I mean, we already play Lycoming and Wilkes every year. You know, we actually have a rivalry game with Lycoming because they're 45 minutes up the road. We play for the River Derby Cup, so we play them every year, and you know, we play Wilkes every year. And both those coaches, Kenny and John, have done a great job with those programs. And you know, I think especially Kenny has really taken Lycoming to a new level. And it's easy trips. They're an hour and a half to an hour and 45 to Wilkes, and like I said, 45 minutes to an hour to Lycoming. And you know, we have some overlap with recruits for them, so it's definitely, you know, something that is going to change things. And you know, I don't know if it was like, oh, we have to get 2 more teams in, but if you're going to have 2 more teams in, you know, within your sport, it's not these are 2, you know, good programs with good coaches and good players that just make the conference that much tougher.
Yeah. So going back to it, like making your job a little bit harder now, right?
Right.
Hey, so you finished second to Scranton, who, unbelievable. I reached out to the coach to see if she'd be interested in an interview. I didn't know they were husband and wife, but I'm interviewing Mike, the head men's coach, next week. Matt, I'm sorry. Interviewing him next week. I'm really excited for that. But and then you you go into the tournament. You're playing E-Town. You beat them for 3-1 during the conference season, the regular season, and then you lost to PKs. Could you just talk about those two games and what, if anything, that was different other than the fact that if you lose, you're out in the tournament versus the regular season? Was there something going on from one game to the next, or was it just that soccer, right?
No, it is. In a way, of course, I think you could always chalk it up to that soccer, but specifically, just because we beat them 3-1 at their place, I don't think we were like a much better team than them. I think we had a couple of really nice goals. It turned in like a crazy weather game. All of a sudden, there was like sideways rain happening, and it became a bit of a mess. And they play on a grass field, their home field, which I think for them defensively can be helpful. It's easier to kind of defend, but the way they play and the way Amy coaches, they're very fast, technical. They play very 1 and 2 touch, and I think that can hinder them sometimes, especially on bad weather days. So I think on our turf field, they actually took a whole step up in their offensive side. And I don't think it caught us off guard necessarily, but you could see they were playing really well, and they played better than us for stretches of that game. I think overall we still, I don't know what the shots were. I think we outshot them. Corners were probably even. Their keeper came up with some really nice saves. They man-marked one of our most talented players, which was a difference from the first game to that, and just kept her locked up as best they could. And they scored on a nice set piece, which I hadn't seen them do a lot of. Was a really nice corner kick they scored on to go up 2-1. And just overall, it was really competitive. Like, just because we finished second and they finished third, I didn't think there was this huge gap between us and E-Town. And honestly, if I look back and really think about it, and I did, after that game ended in the semifinals, I thought about it a lot, and then I tried not to think about it as much as I could for as long as I could. But looking back, I really felt like Amy just outcoached me that day. I feel bad for my players. Yeah, she's a great coach, and she's done a fantastic job with that program. And there's 3 or 4 decisions, and I'm sure most coaches nitpick and really have a hindsight issue when they don't win games. But I felt like there was 3 or 4 substitutions I could have made, in different parts of that game, and maybe one adjustment I could have made after I'd seen at halftime what she did to change, right? Like seeing what the halftime result was, which is 1-0, and knowing what they did, I could have made a change, right? Like, okay, she made her adjustment. I had no idea what she was going to do coming into the game. Now I can make mine. And I forget who said this. They said, it's one of the most difficult things to do as an athlete or coach is to change the strategy that got you to where you are, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of coaches are kind of prisoners to their own routine. Yeah. And I think we were up 1-0 going into halftime. So I'm like, I could make it wouldn't have been a dramatic change, it would have been a pretty simple change. I could do this, but I don't want to concede that we can't just get past it. So I think her decision, she basically overloaded one side over and over and over again. And I could have shaded our one center mid and just basically play secondary outside mid. I didn't, because I didn't want to take away from that. I just thought we could handle it. And looking back, it's a decision I wish I had made.
Yeah. Wow.
And again, on top of that, you go to PKs, which are everyone's favorite.
Oh,
and each team shot 10. So we got all the way to the 10th taker on both sides, and it was way too much. I still haven't recovered, and I feel awful, and I know some of our seniors haven't as well. I feel awful for our players because they deserve better, and I don't think anyone played their best game ever, but I definitely didn't coach my best game, and it's something to take going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's pretty honest take. I will say that that's Look, no matter the level, soccer coaches have egos, right? Like, and so you don't really hear a lot of coaches come out and say, "I didn't have my best coaching day. It's something else. It's the coach did really great on the other team or what have you." So that's really interesting that you said that. I'm actually going to reach out to the coach at E-Town because I'm.
Don't tell her I said that about her. I don't want her ego getting any bigger. No, she's the best. Amy's awesome.
Too late. It's recorded.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Hey, so you mentioned some of your players and whatnot, but you also have a number of outstanding ball players. Just statistically, they're awesome. But Marley Clendenin.
Yep, you said it right.
landmark Defensive Player of the Year, which, right, that alone speaks to the quality. And how important was she to the team? And I'll ask, like, because I think she's a senior and graduating, or at least that's what I'm inferring. How difficult is it to replace a player like that? That's such a stalwart.
It's funny. I think replacing the player is different than replacing her impact, right? Because like there's just every player is unique in their own right, but her impact is almost impossible to replace. Marley, beyond her statistical abilities, I think she scored like 4 or 5 goals her senior year, and just what she's able to do as far as anchoring a defense. She was a 3-year starter, and she started every game that she was healthy for from the day she got here till the day she played her final game. And I think that amount of consistency and leadership and stability is going to be really difficult to replace. She's probably the best defender I've ever coached by a pretty decent margin. And, she was a starting center back. The setting back who started next to her, Aaron Wilson, she started for all 3 years. So they had a center back partnership for every minute, basically, they were here. And it's going to be tough. We got some players coming in, we got some players returning, but it's tough. And you don't really replace it. And Marley, beyond her ability on the field, she was just this incredible personality that's going to be difficult to replace as well. Team captain, and there's a lot she brought to the table. But with 11 seniors that were graduating, whether they played a ton or played a little, that's a big chunk of your team's persona that's going off to graduate. And it's just difficult every year, and it's difficult to say goodbye to them. It's exciting to not have them in a way as a coach, because you're like, it's like a fresh start, but it's definitely going to be difficult to replace someone of that ability and that character and that personality for sure.
Hey, so aside from that, do you have any concerns about going into next year? I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, okay, we fell short on PKs. Man, next year comes and we want to be back in that, but we want to win it. But is there anything that you have in your mind that's like this worries me?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate 11 people who were a part of your program who aren't now, and 11 to 12 new coming in. That's a big shift. And the players who are returning, as far as just pure on-field experience, not a lot. Now the talent's there. I really truly believe our talent is there, but as far as the overall experience, there's not a lot coming back, and that's there's going to be some growing pains with that. It's inevitable. Even if someone comes in with just their fitness, technical, athletically, they're ready, and it's a rarity, but that happens with certain first-year players every year. How are they going to handle that first week of preseason? How are they going to handle that first week of classes? How are they going to handle the first year with midterms? So that's a concern, but I got to be honest, I haven't really set a ton of season goals since I started here. I always talk about the team in front of us, the first one. My goal every year is I want us to be in a position to win every game we play. That's it. And then if you have that as your goal every single day, the goal of winning the conference championship is always available to you, right? That's not to say I don't tell our team I expect us to be in the playoffs for conference every year, but I think if you inevitably look past that first task in front of you, if you do that. So I expect our team to be competitive again next year. We have our toughest opening schedule ever. I don't know why I did this, but we got Misericordia first game of the year. Then we got Dickinson. Then we got Christopher Newport. And we got Virginia Wesleyan. Yeah, I mean, some of that's just because of
good choices, Coach.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we'll be challenged. We'll know where we're at. But but that's the exciting part to me, to be honest, is everything that is going to be difficult. You already know it. Like I just mentioned 2 nationally ranked teams, and I know when we go to play a team that hasn't won double-digit wins in several years next year, that they're still going to be really tough. Like it's all part of it. Winning soccer games is not easy. I don't care who you are. And you could talk to teams that win games 10-0. Even if it felt easy and looked easy that day, the preparation, the time, the energy to get to a spot where you can beat someone 5, 6, 7. In the case of some of the teams out there, 10-0. It's not easy to do that, and that challenge is there no matter who our opponents are. It's just stepped up a notch when you're playing against the best of the best.
Yeah. That's it's never easy, right?
No.
Like you said, it's just never easy. There's no team, especially look in collegiate soccer, right?
Mhm.
There's no team that hums along an entire season.
Yep.
Right? There's always
And even
challenges.
if you were to go to coach, like for example, you go to Colleen at Scranton and say, you guys just went undefeated in the regular season, and and you'd be like, what, were you just like sipping Mai Tais at the end of every game, chilling? There's no way. She's sitting there, she's breaking down film. She's like, oh, I guarantee if you were to sit down with her, she would be like, you have no idea how close we were to losing this game or not scoring the first goal in this game. And that's why she's a great coach.
This game, right?
Yeah, that's why she's a great coach. That's why any team that can appear as if they're breezing through a season, their coaches never let their players think that. And I've not had that experience. I've never breezed through anything, nor would anyone assume we did. But I can only imagine the teams that have. Like our men's team one year, I think 2012, went to the Sweet 16. They were nationally ranked. It wasn't like I was going into, Jim's office and being like, that was easy today, because I can see it on his face. Like, he's just like, God, that was tough. And I think that is what cascades down to the players too. So I think there's challenges all over the place, no matter who you play every game. I'm sure there are challenges for teams that are coming off an unbelievably successful season. Like, what's it like to have to repeat that success? And again, I think that's what goes into this. That's what makes athletics, be it the coaching or the playing, so worth it. The challenges. I always tell my players, if it was easy, you would not enjoy when you're successful. That success as much.
I always say, and I've said it before to other coaches, like, you got to experience the valleys before you could enjoy the peaks, right? Like, it's just.
Oh, I'm stealing that. That's a good one. I'm definitely stealing that.
I totally expect a recognition when you say
SimpleCoach. Dash SimpleCoach right there. Yeah.
Hey, just to shift over to recruiting, what kind of players do you look for? Do you look for positional players, or are you looking for good soccer players? Right? Are you looking for a left back, or are you looking for, hey, I just want a good vision, all that stuff, and then I'll figure out who's the best left back?
My assistant, Rob, who's been a part-time assistant here for like 7 years now, he always says, let's get our most talented 11 on the field, and hopefully they all play the positions they're playing. It's obviously, if someone's a tremendous left back and that's a position of need for you, and that's their priority position, and they want to come to your school, that's a home run. But I don't think that's the reg. I mean, that happens normally. I think that's probably, you're fortunate if that happens.
Yeah.
We're losing 2 4-year starters at center back. So obviously I've been recruiting center backs, and we have 2 coming in. If we had a center mid who had never played a minute of center back in her life, but she's a defensive-minded center midfielder who's great in the air and good with the ball at her feet, and trying her at center back would work, guess what we're doing? And so, and if someone's never played wing in their lives, but they're a fast target striker who can help us out there, they're going to do that. 4-year starter for us, Anna Werner, before she came to Susquehanna, she played target striker for us in our 4-3-3 for 4 years. She was a winger her whole career, but when she got here and she could post up and hold the ball and find beat and get through, and guess what you're playing now, Anna? And I think versatility is critical. And most club coaches, I would assume at this point, and high school coaches are saying, don't tell any college coach you only play one position. Just don't do it. Even if you've never played any other position but center back for me, tell them you can play outside back. Not because a coach wouldn't do it, but that versatility is gold in a full season. Because I'll tell you something, very few players for 4 years play the same position. And very few players for 4 years, if they are, they're that good. And very few players come in and only play one position. Off the bench as a starter at a high level.
So that leads me to the next question, and I was corrected by Roy Dunshee at Washington College. I used to say, hey, what do high school players lack when in that transition from high school to college. And then he said, well, they don't lack it. They just never had the experience. So I kind of try to remind myself. But what are some of the things that you see in high school players where you're like, I want you as part of the program, but I know that it's going to take you time to grow into playing collegiate soccer?
I think there's some basic stuff that almost every player struggles with a little bit, and that's, speed of play is always a little bit faster.
Mhm.
The physicality is a little bit higher. Just the overall play level is a little bit higher for a lot of these players, even if they're playing for some elite club teams
Mhm.
coming out. They still are gonna find it that, okay, it's just everyone's a little bit higher level. There's very few days at practice when the player I'm competing against is going to be not physically as gifted as me, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
on game days. But honestly, training is a huge part of what they've not had as much of. When you're playing club soccer, you play so many more games than you do train
Mhm.
in a club season. And I get why, right? You're trying to get exposed, trying to get college coaches to see you play, trying to get as many opportunities to put film together as you can. But most of these teams are not training 3 or 4 days a week.
Yeah.
And some of it's just because they can't.
Mhm.
You're traveling an hour to club practice, or
Yeah.
you got school and whatever. But when you get to college, you're practicing 4 days a week, sometimes 5.
Mhm.
And how some struggle to put their best training effort together every day is very apparent early on. And even sophomores and juniors and seniors struggle with that sometimes, because not everyone can play. And most players who were coming into your college program played every minute of every game, or close to it for
Yeah.
high school, a ton of club, either as starters or got major minutes. And they're going to play sometimes their entire first season, and the only minutes they'll get are in practice, or
Yeah.
very minimal minutes in games. And that's a struggle. Talk
Yeah.
about a mental struggle for some of these. And I fully admit it's not something I enjoy doing, but no coach can play everyone equally. It's just not
Yeah.
possible. And that's a struggle, coming in and being asked to be unbelievably hardworking, committed 4 days a week for 2-hour sessions sometimes,
And
knowing you're
not
not
being
going to play.
Yeah. And not being rewarded with
Yeah.
playing
Yeah.
time.
And I
Yeah.
mean, I went through that when I played. I barely played, if at all, my freshman and sophomore year. And it's not easy, and I think most players think they're going to start, even the ones who are at least going to play. And sometimes it's because of what you told them. And sometimes it's because of, they think, okay, even though he told me this might not be my first year, or I get on the field a lot, I'll show him. And you
Mhm.
want them to have that attitude. That's
Yeah.
the hardest part of coaching, is I want you to want to play, and I need you to be okay with it when you don't. Like,
Yeah.
that's brutal, and that's a struggle for most people. So beyond the physical side of it, and time management with classes, and
Yeah.
you're being coached. I said this before. You're being coached a lot less in
Yeah.
a 12-month span in college than
Yeah.
you are in high school. The direction that's constant in high school and club is less in college.
Mhm.
So you have to be very self-sustaining in your work, in your touches, in your time management, in a way that you aren't necessarily as a high school student.
Yeah. Um, okay, so and now my last question of the day, and then you could have some time to yourself.
I don't think I could possibly take any more of your time. I just realized what time it was. I apologize.
Yeah. What's the best way for someone to get your attention? Like they want to go to Susquehanna. What's the best way to get on your radar?
I think a hat trick would be pretty good. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, honestly, there's a college out there for everybody.
Yeah.
There really is. I think that's one of the coolest things about the United States, and like, there's some college out there. And if you play college soccer, if you play high school and club soccer, I mean, and you really, or even just high school soccer, and you really want to play college soccer, I bet you there's some place out there for you.
Yeah.
If Susquehanna is where that place for you that you think, then you have to reach out, and I think every coach would say this. I'm not going to read every email in detail that minute and get back to you that second. But if you email us, and if you don't get it back to you right away, email us again. Most of the times they'll get back to you. And once you do that, once you start that communication, I talk about how your interest level in the place I work and the place I coach is going to dictate my interest level in you a lot. If I feel as though you don't have much of an interest level, and this is somewhere that your guidance counselor told you to email, and that's the only reason you did it, you probably won't get the reciprocal interest from me. Obviously, I talked about the 3 characteristics. If you come in and sit down in my office and are letting your parents do all the talking for you and I don't need you to be talkative, but I need you to be attentive, right? I need you to appear as if someone who I'm going to be able to communicate with and coach for 4 years. Someone who seems as though they have an ambition to be a good student and someday a good professional in whatever they choose to do. And then ultimately, you got to be a certain level of player, and you got to bring something to the table, is what I've said. So not everyone brings the same things to the table. Not everyone brings the same level of things to the table. And not everyone necessarily brings playing ability to the table. You got to be able to compete. You can't hurt us at practice, but if you're just solid enough to be a good practice player for 4 years, but you bring all those other intangibles that you know and I know are absolutely critical to the success of a team, those players make my team. They do every year. And I graduate at least one player every year, if not more, who didn't get a lot of time in those 4 years, who I'm like, thank goodness we had them. If I didn't have them on my team 4 years, this would have been so different. They are invaluable. They're leaders.
Invaluable.
They're leaders. They are personality giants. They are going to be probably the most successful people professionally someday. And man, there's probably 3 or 4 players who might not have made it for those 3-4 years. They would have left the team if not for this young lady being there. So you got to bring those things. But if you can't bring the play that I think necessarily, you got to be excellent in other ways as well.
Yeah, I love those players are invaluable. They're gold mines. So what I usually do is I get some whatever your websites are, and I put it down in the description for whoever wants to take a look and reach out. And then if there's anything you want me to post, feel free. I'll gladly do it. But otherwise, just wanted to thank you for your time today. It was an awesome conversation. This was fantastic.
I really appreciate it, and what you're doing is awesome. And anyone I talk to who I think would even remotely enjoy this, I'm going to recommend it to them because I think you do a great job.
Great. Very, very appreciative. Thank you for that. That's this is fun for me. So it's like, like, hey, when can you talk about soccer, right? So
right, indeed.
All right, Coach. Thank you. Best of luck this spring.
Thank you very much.
And give your best to your team. And I'll be watching from my headquarters, SimpleCoach headquarters.
Your man cave there is awesome. Yeah. So, all right, have a good one. I appreciate it.
You too. Thanks.